Hello everyone, my name is Pixlriffs and welcome back to the Hardcore Survival Guide. We're going to build a moss farm, and we're going to do that because we now have a whole lot of access to bone meal thanks to the fact that we built a mob farm recently, and the mob farm leads to the moss farm. Look at all these bone blocks. Look at all these bone blocks ready to be turned into bone meal and fed into a moss machine. Now the flip side of this is that we do need a lot of redstone components, and I think we should have enough, but I want to make sure that we have enough before we get going. So I'm going to do a little bit more trading with my clerics, and we're probably going to craft up a bunch of redstone repeaters because we will need a handful of those at least, and I really need to go mining at some point. But with all the stuff we need safely stashed in these two shulker boxes and a bed in hand, let's head back to the desert. You might be wondering why head back to the desert in the first place, and the main reason for that is that the mob farm is here and we'll need a lot of bone meal to keep this farm running, assuming we want to keep it running for a good length of time. So I'm thinking about turning this area into kind of more of an industrial farming district sort of area where we'll have a lot of farms that are driven by bone meal. Weird to grow all of the crops in the desert, but there's nothing really saying that we can't do that, so we might as well. The other reason is that sand blocks cannot be converted into moss, and while that's not really a problem with this farm, it does tend to convert some of the terrain around it into moss unnecessarily. And if we want to avoid that, we may as well build it surrounded by sand. So I've got all of the supplies in here, and this is a farm that I decided to cook up myself in a creative test world before trying it. So this isn't based on anybody else's tutorial. It will follow a few of the same mechanics. If you're looking for maximum efficiency moss farming, it might be best to look elsewhere, but this will be a perfectly functional moss farm for a single player world. We'll need enough ingredients for another hopper clock, and we'll need a few ingredients to spread the moss to generate stone so that it provides a constant supply of moss, and stuff like pistons to push the stone and moss around. We'll also need a few rails and a hopper minecart for the collection system, but luckily I brought enough iron that we can just slap together a hopper minecart, and hopefully this should all work out well. Let's take a quick nap and then let's build this thing. So to start off, we need to build a stone generator, and I'm going to quickly explain the difference between this and a cobblestone generator, because a lot of the time you'll end up building cobblestone generators for stuff, but unfortunately, moss does not take over cobblestone. It won't replace cobblestone, but natural stone, it will. So we're going to have to build a stone generator. Now, the way cobblestone generators work is usually fairly straightforward. You've got a redstone torch down here, you've got some redstone dust nearby, a block there to connect the redstone dust to the piston, and then you end up pushing cobblestone around. Some sort of waterlogged block up here so that lava can come into contact with water, and then you place a lava source in there, and as it flows over, it gets converted into cobblestone on contact with the water and generates a feed line of cobblestone because the piston is pushing it every time a new block gets generated. Obviously, a more simplified version of this is the classic skyblock cobblestone generator, where you place water flowing down into a block on this side, we place our lava source over here on the opposite side, and where the two meet in the middle, they produce cobblestone. But that's not the only type of stone you can produce by combining water and lava, because if lava flows over the top of water, it actually creates natural stone and not cobblestone. So cobblestone only gets formed when water makes contact with a lava flow, not when lava makes contact with a water flow. And the trick to making natural stone is to make sure that lava always flows over the top of water instead of water flowing into lava from the side or from above. Unfortunately, this means we can't use the same mechanics that we used to push the stone around with a piston once it has formed, because water flows faster than lava does, and instead of forming a block immediately, as we saw just then, the stone actually forms a little bit slower, meaning that by that time the water would already have washed away the redstone torches and we don't get the same redstone reaction. So instead, we're going to be setting this up on a timer a little bit later. First though, we need to set up a row of pistons that's going to push the stone blocks outwards, and we're going to put some stone of any type that is like naturally formed, like diorite, stone, granite, any of the stuff that hasn't already been processed by the player, turned into cobblestone or one of the polished variants, and that's going to act basically just as a barrier for now. It'll be converted into moss a little bit later. Then we're going to place water sources at either end of this, and you'll notice that I'm using polished andesite in the rest of this because that's a block that the moss won't end up converting a little bit later. If we put a row of andesite on top of the pistons here, cover over the water sources on either side with glass blocks so the water source itself doesn't get turned into stone. For the moment, we'll place a temporary row of glass in the front here, and we get to watch what happens as I pour lava over the entire thing. As you'll be able to see, each time the lava slowly flows over some of the water here, it's going to convert that into natural stone. And now the lava has completely spread out to both sides, it will be able to convert any water that flows underneath it. So in theory, if I take out this stone block here, the water is going to flow out for a second, but eventually the lava realizes that there's nothing below it there, and it converts that block back into natural stone. So to keep this generating stone, we actually want to push those blocks out of the way using the pistons. I'm going to craft a stone button real quick to show you the effects of that. The pistons retract, the entire line there gets converted back into stone, with some exceptions. And this is where timing is a very important factor, because as you can see, as the water has flowed in from the sides, it ended up creating cobblestone because these stone blocks on either side here have blocked off the water from flowing in and going underneath the lava. The water can still reform if we take out all of those blocks and let them flow together in the center, but we actually need to time things very precisely if we want all of the stone to generate at once. For that, we're going to set up an etho hopper clock, like I said, similar to the one that we used in our mob farm up there, and that's going to control the timing of this very precisely to make sure that stone all gets generated at once. So this is where we build the etho hopper clock. We're going to have a note block on this side because note blocks can send out a 1-tick pulse that will trigger an observer, and the observer, like so, is going to push all of the pistons at once. That's going to allow this to refill with natural stone, but we also have to make sure it is timed in such a way that the pistons don't move too quickly after that, because lava takes a second or two to reset. So we've got 2 hoppers facing into each other, 2 comparators either side, sticky pistons over each of the comparators, a redstone block in front of one of those, and redstone dots on either end with this note block powering the observer here. I put the lava back in place, so that's slowly converting all of the water underneath here to stone. And the trick here is to put 5 items into our hopper clock. So we're going to place 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cobblestone in the hopper clock like so. And now, hopefully, if the timing is right, this should now generate a pretty solid block of stone. There we go, perfect. Not a single block out of place, and that's going to be essential because any cobblestone that generates in this will not get converted to moss by the second stage of the farm. Now, naturally, the system is eventually going to lock up because the pistons here can't actually push anything more, so we are going to need to switch this off using a lever. With a lever attached to the side of this block, we can switch off the hopper clock just the same way we switch off the clock in that farm, and that allows the entire system to freeze for a second while we do what's next. We can gather up a little bit of the stone here. This is also just a neat way of getting hold of stone if you need to generate a bunch of it. And if you've got a beacon at this point, having haste 2 and efficiency 5 allows you to farm stone instantly, so you can get a whole lot of stone this way if you're so inclined. What we want to do, though, is convert the stone into moss, and we're going to do that by means of a dispenser. Dispensers can actually bone meal moss for you, allowing it to spread to any valid blocks in the area, meaning mainly the stone. If you take a look in the targeted block data on the right-hand side there, when we look at this stone, it does say Minecraft moss replaceable, which basically tags this as a block that can be replaced by moss if moss is bone mealed nearby. If you look at the sand, it doesn't say that. So that's one way you can find out which blocks are replaceable by moss and which aren't. The other, of course, is the Minecraft wiki. But by filling this dispenser with bone meal from the mob farm that we've got up there and the bone blocks that I brought with me, we can have this link up to the redstone mechanism back here, and every time stone is pushed out, it will trigger, automatically turning any of the stone that's generated here into moss. All we have to do is put a moss block in front of this. I'm going to let it generate a few more layers of stone so I can show you this in action. That should be about enough, and then if we activate this dispenser here with a button, it converts some of the surrounding stone blocks into moss, but you'll notice not all of them. There are specific patterns that moss can generate, and sometimes it will reach up to 3 blocks in each direction. Sometimes it will only do 2, or it will do a kind of lozenge in the center here, but not horizontally. So that is something to take into account. The other thing we need to take into account is that now the dispenser fails if we try and bone meal the moss block again, because it's now got a block on top of it. This works kind of like bone mealing a grass block, where it will generate grass on top of it, but it won't generate that again. So we need something to remove whatever ends up covering this moss block, if anything, so that we can activate the dispenser and turn the rest of the stuff around it into moss. Before we go any further, though, I'll remove the glass block here so that we can add a hopper to feed more bone meal into the dispenser later. We'll put a barrel on top of that, and the barrel is actually really useful here because it is a solid block. Even though it's a storage container and we can put a little bit more bone meal in there, it's actually also going to transfer redstone current, and that's going to be especially useful for us in a second. Also, before it causes any more trouble, I'm going to cover up the lava here with a few blocks of andesite. And while that doesn't necessarily prevent some of the wooden blocks around here from catching fire, we're going to build a little bit of stuff on this later, so we may as well get that in there now so I don't accidentally hop into the lava like I just did a second ago. To activate the dispenser, we're actually going to use an observer facing upwards so that it detects when the redstone circuit over here pulses, which is going to be any time that it wants to push a new line of stone out. On top of that observer, we're going to place a repeater. We're going to set it to 2 ticks, and that's actually going to pulse the dispenser a couple more times, filling this whole area up with moss. Next to that repeater, we're going to place, facing down, a piston, and that's what's going to clear off, there we go, the lava is getting a little bit rowdy. That's going to clear off any of the stuff that generates on top of the moss, be it saplings, grass, moss carpet, any of that stuff will get taken out by the piston and cleared out of the way. So now when we pull the lever, this is all a working mechanism, and as it generates stone, the stone is automatically converted into moss by the system here. The piston clears up whatever's on top of the moss block, making it possible to bone meal a second time, and already you'll start to notice that there are a couple of problems here. There are stone blocks creeping their way through the system, and that is because moss will not convert blocks which have some sort of covering on top of them. It's kind of the same thing as the moss block here, basically. If it's been bone mealed once, then it's got something on top of it. You cannot bone meal it again. Moss won't spread to a block that is already covered up by another block, which includes, unfortunately, stuff like the moss carpet we've got here, meaning that we need to clear out this area of moss carpet every time we want the stone around here to be converted into moss. And that's where 2 more dispensers come into play. I'm going to silk touch the glass this time, so hopefully I get it back. We're going to place 1 dispenser there in the center of these glass blocks, and we're going to place another dispenser on the opposite side, making that a nice little symmetrical circuit. And outwards from the barrel here, which is actually going to conduct redstone power thanks to the redstone dust on top of it, we're going to place 2 repeaters, which are going to activate these dispensers, allowing them to flush this area with water and remove all of the moss carpet. And so now we're going to draw out an area, probably I'd say 7 blocks long, around the area that we want to convert into moss, because we want to make sure this has a little bit of headroom just in case some of the blocks don't convert properly. And we also need to make sure that the water from these dispensers is going to flush the entire platform before we get rid of it again. At this stage, I'm going to fill up the rest of the blocks here with stone, because eventually some of this will get converted into moss and some of it will be pushed out of the mechanism, but ideally we want this entire area to be closed off so that when the water starts flowing, it's not going to flow downwards and find another route and not flush the entire platform. We'll get 2 buckets of water from the river here. We'll put 1 of those into each dispenser, and we'll briefly turn the system on so that you can see the effects here. Now, each time it generates a new batch of moss, these water streams are going to push all of the blocks to the end of the platform, and crucially, they clear off all of the moss carpet, azalea saplings, all of the grass, anything that's going to prevent blocks from being converted from stone into moss. We can actually leave the system on like this, although it's not at maximum efficiency right now because the water flows out for a longer period of time than we would like. So that second batch of moss there is actually not going to get converted right away because the water is still out. We'll get to that in a second though, because there is a solution for that. The other thing I want you guys to observe is that the moss blocks here don't actually get pushed by the pistons. Instead, they break and they pop up to the surface because they don't have anywhere else to go. They also get dragged along by the water streams, although some do get pushed out the side, so we'll need to put a barrier along the side here to make sure that doesn't happen. But if I come over here and collect all of this moss, it's already generated more than my inventory can handle because I've just got a ton of other stuff on me, but it's generating a decent amount of moss, seeds, azalea, moss carpet, all of that stuff is coming out of the farm nice and easily. There we go, stack and a half of moss, just like that. Not too shabby, and it only took a little bit of bone meal, but it could take less bone meal because, like I said, it's ignoring 1 cycle of that dispenser because these dispensers have dispensed the water and they haven't retracted it again yet. So what we want to do is take 3 repeaters out to each side of this piece of redstone current. We're going to wrap those around so that the dispensers here get pulsed twice. By the way, the dispenser is being powered by quasi-connectivity here. It's kind of being powered diagonally, but if you find that a little bit too weird, or you're building this on Bedrock Edition and for some reason the redstone works okay on Bedrock Edition, you can place a block there, and that will make sure that the dispenser gets powered without relying on quasi-connectivity later. We're going to place 2 more blocks on the ends here with 2 pieces of redstone dust, so that block ends up getting powered. It will power that repeater, and we're going to set all of these repeaters to 4 ticks, basically allowing the maximum amount of time for the water to flow before it gets retracted again, and that way it should time perfectly with the cycles of the moss dispenser. Of course, we need to get the water back into the dispensers. I tried running it for a second there and realized that, yeah, we would need to put the water back in the dispensers for this to function correctly, because now the dispensers are going to be pulsed twice. They'll expel the water and then they'll retract the water, and hopefully each time they do that there should be a new formation of moss right here. So let's give that a try. Let's turn the system on, and hopefully, yep, that got flooded with water right after the moss, and yep, every time the dispensers retract the water, it's already generating a little bit more moss. We just need to tidy up these areas at the end here, and hopefully that shouldn't be a problem. Now, because the moss ends up generating in sort of random patterns, sometimes you will find that it doesn't do the shape of moss spread that reaches the edges out here. And if it fails that for multiple cycles of the machine, then potentially it can push out these blocks here and here. Because if the stone keeps generating over here and it isn't converted into moss, it's not going to remove any of the blocks from the center. So you might want to place some obsidian blocks on the outside here and here, just to make sure that that doesn't get pushed out and that you don't end up with blocks of stone just protruding out from the end here. But sooner or later, the stone blocks in the center here are going to be converted to moss, so that shouldn't break the machine, because you'll end up with some moss being generated here and then being broken by having been pushed in by the pistons. So all in all, this farm should be relatively reliable and shouldn't need much maintenance after it's made. So now the farm is using the bone meal as efficiently as it can, we can start sticking more of it into this barrel. And this is the only thing you need to do a little bit of maintenance on, is making sure that this barrel ends up getting refilled. And I tried repositioning it a couple of times, but I can't find a particularly smart way of making sure this barrel can be fed through a hopper and have some other kind of container somewhere else, so this might end up being the maximum amount of storage in this farm. But like I said, other moss farms are out there, so if this doesn't quite meet your needs, then it's always worth looking further afield for the smart folks who will make much better farms than I do. But the last thing we need to do is set up a collection mechanism, and that's going to be nice and simple thanks to the water flushing element of the farm, leaving all of the blocks along this last strip of stone here. Of course, the stone can be anything else as long as you don't mind it being pushed around by pistons. What we're going to lay down here is a simple powered rail track. We'll have one section of powered rail there, and the rest of those can all lay out underneath the stone there. We can place a lever back here, and that's going to take care of this section of powered rail. This one here we're going to be able to turn on and off, and that's going to activate and deactivate the collection mechanism. We could even wire everything up to that lever if we wanted to make sure the entire farm gets turned on and off at once, but I expect I'll remember to come down and flick this lever if we want the hopper minecart to do its thing. Off to this side over here is where we're going to have our chests, so I'm going to dig up the sand just a little bit here so that we can put in 3 double chests, which should be more than enough if we want to AFK at this farm. Run the powered rail back along the top, and the minecart should now deliver all of the items it collects into these 3 chests, including this last chest at the end here if we switch off the collection mechanism for the farm, while the hopper minecart still has goods inside it. Let's see, how much more bone meal do we need to bring down from the farm? About a full chest's worth, more or less. Okay, I think that's going to be another 3 stacks of bone blocks, more or less, but we should be able to handle that. Let's switch on the farm for now. Let's switch on the collection mechanism as well. Let's see the hopper minecart do its thing, and let's also fill in the sides of this with, let's say, spruce logs. I feel like they kind of fit the mossy aesthetic, and they shouldn't be convertible into moss. They've also got glass blocks over the top of them, so even if they were convertible, it probably wouldn't happen that way. I think the only thing preventing this farm from being totally lossless is occasionally the random travel of one of the moss blocks or moss carpet around here means it ends up on top of one of the repeaters at the back. I've only seen that happen once or twice though, so overall it should be a pretty effective farm, and you could probably even put some trapdoors or something up there to make sure that didn't happen again. And the cool thing is, with this farm established down here, I can actually step away from it, AFK up here at the mob farm, and when I come back from my AFK session, this should also have produced a ton of moss. And from the looks of things, just that short session has actually gone pretty well. It's still transferring a few more drops from the hopper minecart. Look at all the azalea as well. This is basically going to be an azalea tree farm in a way, or an azalea sapling farm anyway. But yeah, having this amount of moss is going to be great, and I think moss blocks are the main thing I want this for. You might be wondering why set up a moss farm like this in the first place when moss spreads fairly easily, and the answer to that is there is some places where it doesn't spread and you want to get hold of it and place it manually, like here in the desert. In some of my other series, I've ended up converting sections of the desert into a more lush environment like an oasis, and having a lot of moss blocks to place is actually really useful that way. You can also convert basically anything this farm produces into bone meal using composters. And that's not my aim here, but we might actually end up filtering out some of the more useless items here. The wheat seeds, the moss carpet, maybe even some of the azalea once I feel like I've got enough of it. We can filter all of that down into composters, leaving just the moss blocks. We could set up an item sorter for this storage output. We could do all kinds of stuff with it, but I think for now, I'm happy just getting hold of the moss blocks and using them for a little bit more building. There we go, there's the troublesome piece of moss carpet. I do think maybe if we ended up putting, like, you know, a trapdoor there or something like that, it would make sure this farm stayed lossless. But yeah, like I said, no real need to worry about that when the farm is already producing so much. So there it is, a pretty compact design, a tidy little project, and a near infinite supply of moss, which can lead to a near infinite supply of bone meal. And with all of the farm's output being converted into bone meal, this farm actually might end up making more bone meal than it uses. So as long as you don't mind refilling that bone meal manually, you might end up with a pretty self-sustaining moss farm as well. So I'm going to let this farm go. I'm going to AFK up at the mob farm for maybe like half an hour, and we'll see how much moss we have at the end of that. Okay, half an hour is up, and I did go back and forth to the farm once just to make sure that everything was okay and it wasn't running out of bone meal immediately, and I grabbed a bunch of bones from the collection area for the mob farm. So we can hop on down here. It's clear to me already that something has gone a little bit awry with the stone generator, because there is a bunch of this sticking out this far, but it looks like it's still managing to produce moss. In fact, it may have overloaded the collection mechanism ever so slightly. I'm going to turn this off, and I think it is still producing, yeah, it's still definitely producing moss. We've got probably about, yeah, half a dispenser's worth of bone meal in here. Almost exactly half left, actually. So after half an hour, it was basically done with the contents of the hopper, what was left in the barrel, and about half the dispenser. So maybe, yeah, maybe about a full dispenser's worth plus a couple of extra stacks. Not too bad. Let's take a look at the contents of the chest. I'm going to have to dig them out from underneath the stone, and it's a little bit weird that this area has some cobblestone in it. Doesn't seem to have affected the rest of the farm. I think that may have just been some weird, like, you know, lag or something like that, maybe from the fact that I was generating mobs at the mob farm as well. But yep, that's looking pretty good. That is looking very, very promising. We have at least a chest of moss there, possibly even a double chest of moss blocks, and then all of the other drops and stuff besides. I'm going to shove a bunch more bone meal into the barrel up here and the dispenser, and then I'll see how much there actually is still lying around on top of the farm here. Okay, it's still filtering down into the hopper, but we've basically filled up that barrel with the bones that were hanging around in the farm. I still have a little bit more to collect from down there, but it looks like we still have a whole lot of moss blocks, and a little bit has hopped up onto the sides here that I could probably do with building up the walls of the farm a little bit. But that's another 5 stacks of moss blocks. And then coming on down here, remember, this is only about half an hour's worth of AFK time. I did not AFK for more than that. Let's divide all of this up into different chests and see what we actually have here. So I've sorted it all out into different chests, and in the end, we got more than a double chest of moss blocks. I actually have a little bit left in my inventory here from that half-hour AFK session, which just wouldn't fit in the chest. We have this much moss carpet, almost a full chest, and a little bit extra, so not quite a double chest, but still a pretty impressive haul. And then more azalea saplings than I think I will ever need, pretty much, along with a bunch of wheat seeds. All of that could end up being composted, all of that could end up being composted, and I think we would probably have about as much bone meal as we used here. Plus, of course, we've got all of the moss blocks in here, which would compost the best out of everything, but is still really nice to have a full chest of moss blocks to take back. I think I'll probably throw those in a shulker box here and there, maybe grab some from the ender chest and move the entire thing back to the base so that we can do a little bit more terraforming work around there using moss. But all in all, a pretty successful moss farm, completely refilled on bone meal thanks to the mob farm over here, and I think that is where we're going to wrap up this episode of the Hardcore Survival Guide. We'll be doing more farming with bone meal for the rest of this week. I'll probably end up clearing up the cobblestone in here as well, but for now, that's going to be it from me. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you guys soon. Take care. Bye for now.